Susan's mother was skeptical of Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew's marriage from the very beginning. Long before the world watched Westminster Abbey with bated breath on July 23, 1986, quiet questions circulated within the private circles of the future Duchesses of York. Years later, a royal reporter made it clear that even within their own family, there was uncertainty. The great love story, which appeared to the public like a modern fairy tale, apparently had a different, more complex backstory behind closed doors. At the heart of the early skepticism was the question of motives. According to reports which were also picked up by Andrew Loney, some family members wondered whether Sarah Ferguson had fallen in love with Prince Andrew as a person or with what he symbolized. His title, influence, and access to Britain's most exclusive stage. It is particularly noteworthy that these doubts did not originate from anonymous critics, but from circles who had known her since her childhood. Major Ronald Ferguson, her father, was known to be proud of his daughter's union with a son of Queen Elizabeth II. However, he is also said to have felt a certain unease. As a longtime polo manager for Prince Philip and later for Prince Charles, he knew exactly the dynamics within the royal family. He was familiar with the expectations, the discipline, the quiet ruthlessness behind the scenes. The idea that his spirited daughter would become part of this system likely stirred both ambition and concern in him. Susan, Sarah's mother, is also said to have approached the union with some caution. It was well known in her circle that a royal marriage brought not only privileges but also enormous responsibilities. The unspoken question of whether such a lively, independent personality as Sarah Ferguson would fit into this structure hung in the air. At the same time, Sarah Ferguson had been moving in the right circles for years. She was well connected in Britain and familiar with the family. Her childhood was spent in the orbit of the court, not least due to her father's professional relationship with Prince Philip. This proximity made her a predictable choice for the palace, at least on paper. But this was precisely where the tension began. Some observers described her as charmingly witty and extremely sociable. Others emphasized her impulsiveness and her pronounced desire for an extraordinary life. She worked for a time at a publishing company and later in an art gallery. But her ambitions seemed to stretch further. She wanted more than an ordinary existence in London's middle class. She wanted visibility, significance, dynamism. When she met Prince Andrew again at Royal Ascot in 1985, the timing was remarkably opportune. The prince, 25 years old, freshly returned from active service in the Royal Navy, was under increasing pressure from Queen Elizabeth II to find a suitable wife. The country watched the second-born son's every move with great interest. A stable marriage was considered a strategic necessity for the monarchy. Within a few months, the relationship developed rapidly. The speed of the engagement raised eyebrows among some observers. Was it passion or pragmatism on both sides? Sarah Ferguson undoubtedly knew how to win hearts. She made Queen Elizabeth laugh, got along well with Prince Philip, and appeared refreshingly unaffected in public. But it was precisely this spontaneity that also attracted doubt. The perception circulated that she knew exactly which circles she had to move in. This perception reinforced the question of whether she had married not just into a man, but into a system. In an environment where marriages traditionally also have strategic dimensions, this distinction is hardly clear-cut. A central theme of her latest story was already emerging here: the tension between authenticity and ambition. Was Sarah Ferguson a young woman who fell head over heels in love, or was she an ambitious individual who recognized her opportunity and seized it decisively? These early doubts never completely disappeared. They accompanied every phase of her marriage, every headline, every controversy. In retrospect, they almost seem like a harbinger of the dramatic developments of the following years. Was the family more realistic than the public at the time? Had Major Ronald Ferguson and Susan instinctively recognized how difficult the path ahead would be? Or were these simply old prejudices being projected onto a self-assured woman who dared to reach for the stars? The questions from back then still resonate today and form the starting point for one of the most controversial royal stories of modern times. The wedding on July 23, 1986, at Westminster Abbey seemed like the last great royal highlight of a decade in transition. Millions of viewers watched as Sarah Ferguson, with a 17-foot-long ivory train, a sparkling tiara, and a radiant smile, stood beside Prince Charles. The images went around the world. For a moment, Britain seemed united in enthusiasm. But behind the festive facade of Westminster Abbey and Buckingham Palace, a palpable reserve already existed. Within the palace, the union was considered both practical and risky. Sarah Ferguson was British, had known the royal family since childhood, and moved naturally in the circles of Prince Philip and Prince Charles. Her family connections, particularly through Major Ronald Ferguson, made her a familiar figure. This proximity was an advantage. She was no stranger, no international wildcard. For Queen Elizabeth II, this meant stability, but stability had a downside. Sarah Ferguson brought a lively, impulsive energy that didn't appeal to everyone. While Queen Elizabeth appreciated her humor and Prince Philip apparently found her direct style amusing, some courtiers viewed her unconventionality with skepticism. Her warm nature, open body language, and tendency to make spontaneous remarks were perceived internally not only as refreshing but also as potentially problematic. She laughed, spoke loudly, and embraced people in public without restraint. Traits considered endearing by the public seemed almost unpredictable in the strictly regulated environment of Buckingham Palace. A former court employee is said to have described her as entertaining but not a safe choice for a royal bride. This assessment reflected the fear that she would truly fit into the constraints of the monarchy. At the same time, public enthusiasm grew. The media dubbed her the People's Duchess, a stark contrast to the increasingly strained atmosphere surrounding Prince Charles and Diana. Sarah Ferguson seemed more approachable, less aloof, more natural. This very image brought a breath of fresh air to the institution, at least in the short term. But with her newfound popularity came increased media attention and, consequently, pressure. Structural problems surfaced in the very first months of the marriage. The prince remained heavily involved in his duties with the Royal Navy. His absences often lasted for months. Reports indicate that the couple spent only about 40 days a year together during the first 5 years of their marriage. This figure was sobering and called into question the romantic narrative of royal bliss. The young wife found herself increasingly isolated. While the prince was at sea, Sarah Ferguson was alone in the spotlight. Every appearance, every gesture, every fashion choice was scrutinized. The tabloids, which had initially celebrated her, began searching for flaws. The first stories about expensive purchases and extravagant vacations began to circulate. Inside the palace, scrutiny intensified. Some of Queen Elizabeth II's advisors feared that Sarah Ferguson's desire for visibility might clash with traditional expectations of restraint. The monarchy was already in a sensitive phase at the end of the 1980s. Economic uncertainty in the country intensified criticism of the lavish lifestyle within the royal circle. At the same time, the relationship between Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew remained publicly intact. Official engagements were fulfilled, charitable projects undertaken, and photographs staged. However, the emotional distance resulting from absence and structural constraints became increasingly apparent. The initial euphoria gave way to a sobering reality. Years later, Andrew Loney addressed reports that the speed of the engagement had already raised questions at the time. In retrospect, the dynamics seemed almost breathless. A relationship that had developed at breakneck speed now had to withstand the long-term test. The fairy tale wedding was thus less the beginning of a stable chapter than the prelude to a period of intense adjustment and growing tensions. What appeared to the outside world as a triumph of romance developed behind the walls of Buckingham Palace into a complex balancing act between individuality and institution. Was the public's enthusiasm an illusion that obscured structural problems? Or was it precisely the strict expectations of the court that put a young marriage under pressure? One thing is certain: the first cracks appeared earlier than many wanted to admit, and they would soon deepen dramatically. With growing public interest began a phase in which admiration and mistrust became dangerously intertwined. What initially seemed like a modern success story increasingly became an ordeal for Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew. The distance caused by Andrew's duties in the Royal Navy not only exacerbated personal tensions but also opened the door to speculation. While Prince Andrew was away on duty for months at a time, Sarah Ferguson alone was in the media spotlight. Her vibrant personality, once celebrated as refreshing, was now viewed more critically. Tabloids registered every change in her appearance, reporting on high spending, luxurious vacations, and an allegedly extravagant lifestyle. In a time of economic uncertainty, every headline about shopping sprees or exclusive trips felt particularly sensitive. Nervousness grew within Buckingham Palace. Some of Queen Elizabeth II's advisors saw their pre-wedding fears confirmed. Sarah Ferguson did not easily fit into the rigid protocol. Her openness to the press, her spontaneous nature, and her need for social interaction clashed with traditional expectations of discretion and restraint. At the same time, her sense of isolation intensified. The young Duchess moved in an environment that tolerated few missteps. Every public appearance was analyzed. Every private decision could become headline news. The marriage itself was under structural pressure that left little room for normalcy. When two people only live together for a few weeks a year, a distance develops that puts even the strongest bonds to the test. Andrew Loney later noted that the initial euphoria of the union had masked reality. The speed of the engagement and wedding had left little time for the relationship to truly stabilize. While the public continued to cling to the image of the happy Duchesses of York, the balance of power shifted behind the scenes. Sarah Ferguson began to move increasingly outside the tightly controlled royal sphere. Friendships, social appearances, and travel apparently offered her a form of freedom. But it was precisely this freedom that fueled new rumors. The question of her motives, which had already arisen before the wedding, was given renewed impetus. Critics saw her behavior as proof that she was seeking attention. Supporters argued that she was simply trying to preserve her identity in an extreme situation. The media logic of the late 1980s further intensified this dynamic. Sensational headlines sold better than sober analysis. Sarah Ferguson became a projection screen. Her weight, her clothing, her demeanor, everything was publicly commented on. The pressure was not only institutional but also personal. At the same time, the monarchy as a whole entered a period of heightened scrutiny. The relationship between Prince Charles and Diana was becoming increasingly strained. In this environment, sensitivity to any sign of instability within the royal family grew. Sarah Ferguson was thus not only experiencing an individual crisis, but also navigating a system under general strain. With each new report, a narrative seemed to solidify. The story of an impulsive duchess struggling to conform to court discipline. Whether this portrayal reflected reality or was a media construct remained a matter of debate. But the damage was beginning to mount. Prince Philip was said to have become increasingly impatient. Queen Elizabeth I, who personally valued Sarah Ferguson, faced the challenge of balancing familial loyalty with institutional responsibility. The monarchy, in a period of societal upheaval, could not afford a sustained negative publicity. The tipping point was approaching gradually. The combination of physical separation, constant media scrutiny, and institutional skepticism created a fragile situation. The question was no longer whether tensions existed, but when they would surface. Was Sarah Ferguson a victim of a system that left little room for individuality, or did her decisions confirm the early doubts of those around her? The answer likely lay in a complex mix of personal insecurity, public pressure, and structural rigidity. What was certain was that the ground beneath the fairy tale narrative was beginning to crumble seriously, and what had been brewing in the late 1980s would culminate in an explosion in the early 1990s that shook not only a marriage but the public image of an entire institution. 1992 would go down in history as the year that shattered the facade of the British monarchy and became the definitive turning point for Sarah Ferguson. What had been building up over years erupted with full force within a few days. The already fragile marriage to Prince Andrew was now under a harsh spotlight that left no detail in shadow. In August, photographs were published showing Sarah Ferguson on holiday in France, alongside her American financial advisor, John Bryan. The pictures spread like wildfire. For the public, they were a sensation for Buckingham Palace, a humiliation, and a particularly explosive one. At the time, she was still legally married to Prince Andrew. Within the palace, the mood shifted dramatically. Prince Philip was said to be deeply angered. For many observers, the photographs confirmed fears that had already been quietly voiced in 1986. The impulsive, free-spirited Duchess had once again maneuvered herself into a situation incompatible with the expectations of a royal representative. The media frenzy was enormous. The tabloids seized the opportunity for a veritable barrage of reports. Sarah Ferguson was no longer portrayed as a people-oriented duchess, but as a symbol of lost control. The word scandal dominated the headlines. The pressure on Queen Elizabeth and the institution of the monarchy grew noticeably. Just a few days after the publication of the photos, it was clear that the situation could no longer be resolved internally. Sarah Ferguson was effectively pushed out of the inner circle of royal life. Official engagements were drastically reduced. Public appearances were minimized. The separation from Prince Andrew became irreversible. For many within the family, this moment confirmed earlier doubts. The question of her motives was now raised again, this time with a considerably harsher tone. Was this the inevitable outcome of a relationship that had begun too quickly, too euphorically, and perhaps too unequally? At the same time, the context cannot be ignored. 1992 was a crisis year for the British monarchy as a whole. Other marriages within the family were also experiencing turmoil. The institution was under historically high pressure. In this atmosphere, every additional scandal acted like an accelerant. Sarah Ferguson herself increasingly found herself caught in a spiral of public criticism and personal insecurity. The media coverage was intense and often merciless. Her mistakes were widely exploited, her personality reduced to a few buzzwords. The person behind the headlines disappeared behind an image that allowed for hardly any nuance. Prince Andrew remained publicly reserved, but the distance between the two was undeniable. The official divorce followed in 1996. Nevertheless, their relationship would never completely end, a circumstance that later sparked renewed speculation. The 1992 scandal marked not only the end of a marriage in its original form, but also the end of an illusion. The fairy tale narrative had finally shattered. What remained was a story of expectations, pressure, and misjudgments. Was this downfall inevitable? Could different management by Buckingham Palace have altered the course of events? Or was the dynamic between public curiosity, personal freedom, and institutional constraints simply too volatile from the outset? One thing is certain. With the photographs from France, a simmering crisis had escalated into an open confrontation. Sarah Ferguson was no longer just a controversial duchess. She had become a symbol of a monarchy grappling with the demands of a new media era. And yet, this was not the end of her story, for while many had already written her off, it would soon become clear that her name would appear in headlines many more times, with consequences that extended far beyond 1992. Anyone who thought that Sarah Ferguson's divorce from Prince Andrew in 1996 would bring peace was soon mistaken. While the formal separation ended her official role as an active member of the royal family, it by no means marked the end of the headlines. On the contrary, the years following the split became a period in which financial problems, media gaffes, and new controversies further damaged her public image. After the divorce, Sarah Ferguson continued to live in relatively close proximity to Prince Andrew, including at the Royal Lodge in Windsor. This unusual situation, divorced but still closely connected, regularly fueled speculation. At the same time, she faced a very practical problem: money. Reports of debt, unfortunate investments, and extravagant lifestyles surfaced time and again. Critics accused her of never having truly learned to live with financial discipline. Supporters countered that the loss of official support and the simultaneous expectation of maintaining a certain standard of living presented a virtually insurmountable dilemma. Perhaps the most serious setback occurred in 2010. A hidden camera recorded Sarah Ferguson promising a supposed businessman access to Prince Andrew in exchange for £500,000. The footage quickly spread, triggering a wave of outrage in Britain. For many, this was the moment that solidified the image of a woman who repeatedly made risky decisions. The reaction was unequivocal. Sarah Ferguson publicly admitted to having made a grave mistake, but the damage had been done. The incident reinforced the perception that financial hardship made her prone to rash actions. For Buckingham Palace, it was yet another blow to its image. This time without formal responsibility, but with undeniable proximity to the institution. As if this weren't enough, her name resurfaced in connection with Jeffrey Epstein. Sarah Ferguson admitted to accepting financial assistance from Epstein in 2010 to pay off existing debts. She later described this decision as a grave error. But in an environment already sensitive to any connection with Epstein, the mere association was toxic. For many observers, this brought things full circle. As early as the late 1980s, there had been concerns that impulsiveness or a need for attention could lead her into trouble. Now these fears seemed confirmed. The recurring triad of financial problems, risky contacts, and negative headlines solidified a narrative that was difficult to correct. At the same time, it would be an oversimplification to reduce her story solely to missteps. Sarah Ferguson began to establish herself as an author, became involved in charitable projects, and strove for a gradual rehabilitation of her image. She was seen again at select family gatherings, particularly in the context of her daughters and later as a grandmother. Public perception, however, remained divided. For some, she was a cautionary tale about the price of unchecked ambition. To others, she was a woman who, at a young age, was thrust into an extremely high-profile system and made mistakes that many people would make under pressure, only in front of a global audience. Prince remained a constant figure in her life. Despite the divorce, the two remained close. This enduring bond continues to raise questions. Was it loyalty, habit, or a sign that the emotional foundation of their relationship was stronger than critics suspected? In any case, the scandals of the 2000s and 2010s showed that the 1992 split was not an isolated event, but part of a longer, complex development. Sarah Ferguson repeatedly teetered on the edge between a comeback and renewed controversy. Was she a victim of her own decisions or of a system that doesn't forget its mistakes? The answers to these questions remain contested. But what is undeniable is that her name still evokes strong reactions decades after her 1986 wedding. 4 decades after the glamorous wedding at Westminster Abbey, the central question has still not been silenced. Was the marriage between Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew based on genuine love or strategic ambition? The answer appears to be more complex than headlines could ever depict. Despite their official divorce in 1996, Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew remained unusually close. They continued to live under the same roof at Royal Lodge in Windsor, appeared together at select family events, and presented themselves as functioning parents to Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. To many observers, this situation seemed paradoxical. Separated but not truly separated. It is precisely this continued closeness that its defenders interpret as evidence of genuine affection. They argue that a purely calculated marriage would hardly have produced such stability after a divorce. Had it been solely about status or money, contact would likely have ceased after the breakup. Instead, a connection persisted that defies easy categorization. Sarah Ferguson herself has repeatedly emphasized that she married Prince Andrew for love. In interviews, she has stated that she married her husband, not the title. This portrayal stands in direct contrast to the early doubts that, according to Andrew Loney and other royal reporters, were already circulating within the family. But love and ambition are not mutually exclusive, especially not within an institution like the British monarchy. Marriages in the royal context are rarely purely private. They always carry a symbolic, political, and media dimension. Anyone entering this world is aware of the weight of their decision. Over the years, the royal household's attitude has noticeably shifted. While Sarah Ferguson was effectively isolated after 1992, a cautious rapprochement later emerged. She was seen again at certain family events, particularly in the company of her daughters and grandchildren. This gradual rehabilitation suggests that the internal assessment has become more nuanced. At the same time, the shadow of past scandals remains. The connections to Jeffrey Epstein, the £500,000 affair, and the photographs from France are part of a public memory that cannot be completely erased. For critics, they are evidence of a pattern of impulsive decision-making. For supporters, these incidents mark human failings under extreme pressure. Remarkably, despite all the controversy, Sarah Ferguson never completely disappeared from the public consciousness. She established herself as an author, engaged in charitable work, and built a distinct profile. Her image transformed from that of a fallen duchess to a resilient figure who survived setbacks. In retrospect, the early doubts of Major Ronald Ferguson and Susan seem less like a prejudgment and more like an intuitive premonition of the challenges to come. The question, however, is whether these challenges resulted from personal motives or from structural tensions between individuality and the institution. Was Sarah Ferguson the wrong person at the wrong time, or was she a personality who simply didn't fit the rigid protocol of the 1980s? Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between. A woman with genuine feelings for Prince Andrew, but also with a desire for an extraordinary life. Today, her story seems less like a one-dimensional scandal and more like a complex chapter in modern monarchical history. She embodies the friction between tradition and personal freedom, between public role and private needs. The crucial question remains: would her marriage have lasted under different circumstances, or was the system itself too inflexible for a personality like Sarah Ferguson's? The story of Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew is not a simple tale of rise and fall. It is a reflection of an institution in flux, and a woman who never quite fit the prescribed mold. Sarah Ferguson's story begins with doubts within her own circle and culminates in one of the most complex relationships in the modern monarchy. From the fairy tale wedding to Prince Andrew, through the increasing isolation caused by his absences, to the scandals of 1992 and 2010 and the connections to Jeffrey Epstein, a common thread runs through the tension between personal freedom and institutional expectations. Early warnings from Major Ronald Ferguson and Susan do not appear unfounded in retrospect. Within Buckingham Palace, there was skepticism from the outset regarding a personality who was vividly impulsive and public-oriented. The marriage suffered from structural distance, media pressure, and individual misjudgments. Nevertheless, the extraordinary closeness between Sarah Ferguson and Prince Andrew, even after their divorce, remains a strong counterargument to the theory of pure calculation. Their continued connection, their joint appearances at family events, and their close relationship with Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie point to an emotional foundation that cannot be explained by ambition alone. Was she a woman drawn to the allure of the crown, or a young personality caught in a system that left little room for individuality? Perhaps she was both ambitious and in love, impulsive and loyal. The debate remains open, and that is precisely what makes her story so fascinating to this day. What do you think? Were the early doubts justified? Or was Sarah Ferguson judged more harshly than others? Share her